The wind that night was louder than anything Elias Turner had heard in years. His small log cabin stood alone on the open plains, far from the nearest town and miles away from any neighbor. Snow swirled past the windows like white dust, blocking out the moon and sky. Elias sat near the fireplace with a cup of hot coffee, listening to the storm rattle the roof. He had seen many winters in his life, but something about this storm felt different, stronger, colder and angrier. Elias lived alone now. He had grown up on this land with his parents, but both had passed away long ago. After that, he chose a quiet life. He had horses, a few cows, and a faithful old dog buried behind the barn. He had learned to enjoy silence, even though sometimes it felt too heavy. The hardest moments were on nights like this, when the wind screamed like a lonely spirit and the cabin felt smaller than usual. He had spent the whole day preparing for the storm, stacking firewood, feeding the animals, checking the doors. By evening, he thought nothing else could surprise him. But life often had different plans, especially on the plains, just after midnight. A sound cut through the roar of the storm. A knock at first. Elias thought he imagined it. No one traveled on nights like this. No rider, no wagon, no traveler would ever risk being out in such deadly cold. He listened again, holding his breath. The knock came a second time, louder, weaker, almost desperate. Elias stood up slowly, unsure if it was wise to open the door. But the wind sounded like it carried pain with it, and he could not ignore someone who might be in trouble. He took his lantern, walked to the door, and opened it only a crack. What he saw made him pull the door wider without thinking. A young Apache woman stood there, shivering violently. Snow covered her hair and shoulders. Her skin was pale from the cold, and her lips trembled. She looked like she had been fighting the storm for hours. Her eyes, dark and wide, held fear and exhaustion. Her voice broke as she pleaded, "Let me in, or you'll lose me to the cold." Elias had helped travelers before, but he had never seen someone in such desperate condition. Her arms hung weakly at her sides, and she could barely hold herself upright. He reached out, steadying her by the arm, and guided her inside. "Come in," he said softly. "You're safe now." She stepped inside, and the warmth from the fire touched her face. For a moment, she closed her eyes as if the simple heat was a blessing. Elias hurried to close the door, fighting against the wind, pushing it open. When the cabin was sealed again, he turned to her. She stood still, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor. Her clothes were soaked, her hands stiff from frostbite, and her breathing uneven. "Sit by the fire," Elias said, pointing to a chair. His voice stayed calm, but inside, he worried deeply for her condition. "Warm yourself. I'll get a blanket." She nodded slowly, still shaking, and moved to the fire as if her legs barely remembered how to walk. Elias wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, then placed another one around her feet. He poured warm tea from the pot and handed it to her. "Ah." She held the cup with both hands, though her fingers trembled so much that Elias had to steady it. "Drink slowly," he said. "It'll help." She took a few small sips before whispering, "Thank you. I thought I wouldn't make it." Elias pulled up another chair but kept a respectful distance. He wanted her to feel safe. "What happened?" he asked gently. "I'm Naira," she said, her voice soft but stronger now that warmth returned to her body. "I was traveling with my people. The storm came fast, too fast. I got separated from the others while looking for the horses. The snow was everywhere. I couldn't see. I walked until I saw a small light. Your cabin." Elias nodded slowly. "You walked far in this cold? That's brave, but dangerous." "I had no choice," Naira replied. Her eyes lowered. "I didn't want to die out there." Elias studied her for a moment. Her face showed strength, but also deep exhaustion. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s. Her hair, long and dark, still held bits of snow. Her hands were rough from travel, yet delicate in shape. She wore simple clothing meant for riding, not for surviving a deadly blizzard. "You're safe now," Elias repeated. "The storm is bad, maybe the worst this winter. You can stay here until it passes." Naira's eyes softened with relief. "I'm grateful." Minutes passed quietly as she warmed up, the fire crackling between them. The storm outside grew louder, making the cabin walls tremble. Elias added more logs to the fire, making the room brighter. He noticed how Naira held her hands close to the flames, looking almost afraid they would stop giving warmth. "You must have been out there for hours," he said. "I don't know how long," she whispered. "Everything was white. My fingers went numb. I kept thinking, if I fall, no one will find me." Her voice shook, and Elias understood the fear she carried. He had lived through storms like this all his life, but he had always had shelter. Being lost out there was like being swallowed by the world itself. "You did the right thing coming here," Elias said. "You were lucky to see the light." Naira looked at him, her expression gentle. Maybe not lucky, maybe guided. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and handed her a second cup of warm tea. As she drank, her breathing steadied. Her face regained color. Her hands stopped shaking. She looked around the cabin's simple wooden walls, shelves with old books, a worn table, a rifle leaning in the corner. Everything smelled faintly of pine and smoke. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes," Elias replied. "Been that way for a long time." Naira studied him with curious eyes. "A man living alone must be strong, or stubborn," Elias said with a small laugh. For the first time, Naira smiled. It was a soft, tired smile, but real. Outside, the wind slammed against the window, reminding them both that the world was still frozen and wild. Inside, the fire glowed warm, creating a small island of safety in the middle of the storm. "You should rest," Elias said after a while. "There's a spare bed in the other room. You've had a hard night." Naira hesitated. "You trust me?" she asked quietly. "If you meant harm," Elias said, "you wouldn't have knocked on my door in the middle of a blizzard." Naira lowered her eyes. "Thank you. You're kind." Elias fetched more blankets and guided her to the small bedroom. The bed was simple handmade, with wool sheets and a thick quilt. Naira touched the quilt with surprise. "It's warm," she said softly. "I hope so," Elias replied. "It's kept me alive through many winters." She turned toward him, her eyes full of tired gratitude. "If not for you, I would still be out there." Elias shook his head. "Anyone would have opened their door." "Not everyone," Naira whispered. For a moment, their eyes met. Outside, the storm roared like a wild beast. Inside, a silent understanding passed between them, strangers brought together by danger, warmth, and fate. "Rest," Elias said gently. Naira lay down, pulling the blankets around her. Within minutes, her breathing slowed. She had fallen into a deep sleep, safe for the first time since the storm began. Elias stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her sleep. He didn't know much about her, only her name and that she was brave enough to survive the worst winter could offer. But something about her presence changed the air in the cabin. The silence didn't feel as empty tonight. He closed the door, halfway to give her privacy, then returned to his chair by the fire. He added more wood, making the flames rise. He listened to the storm scream outside, but his mind kept returning to the moment the door opened and Naira stood there, asking for life itself. Elias stayed awake long into the night, guarding the warmth, keeping the fire alive, and thinking about this strange twist of fate that had brought an Apache woman to his lonely cabin on a snowbound night. He had no idea how the coming days would unfold, but he knew this night, the night of the knock, the plea, and the rescue, had changed something inside him. The storm did not end with the morning light. Instead, it continued through the day, blowing stronger than before. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and the world outside seemed lost in a thick white silence. Roads and paths disappeared, and even the mountains in the distance were hidden under a thick, cold fog. For Elias Turner and Naira, this meant they were trapped together, for now, in a small, warm island of wood and fire amidst the endless winter. At first, there was quiet tension between them. Elias moved about his cabin, feeding the animals and chopping more wood to keep the fire going, while Naira stayed near the hearth, drying her soaked clothes and warming her hands. Both were polite but cautious, unsure how much the other could be trusted. Each had spent time alone, relying only on themselves. Sudden companionship felt unfamiliar and fragile. Elias watched Naira from across the room. She was careful in her movements, gentle even in simple tasks like folding wet clothing or pouring tea. He admired her skill, her awareness, and her patience with herself in this new environment. Though young, she carried herself with quiet dignity and quiet strength. Even her eyes, dark, thoughtful, and alert, showed that she had endured much, far beyond what her years suggested. Finally, Naira spoke. "You work hard, even in storms like this," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but her tone carried curiosity and a hint of admiration. "Is it always like this? Keeping a place warm while the world outside rages?" Elias chuckled quietly, a low, warm sound. "It's part of life out here. You prepare for the worst and hope it doesn't happen. But sometimes, it does anyway." He paused and added, "I've lived many winters, and they all teach the same lesson. Respect the wind, and respect life itself." Right. Naira nodded, sipping her tea. "Your words? They carry peace, even when the world is harsh. I can feel it." The snow continued falling outside, relentless. But inside, the cabin grew quieter, calmer. As the hours passed, Elias began to open up, sharing small stories about the ranch, his work with the cattle, and the quiet years he had spent alone. Naira listened carefully, never interrupting, sometimes offering questions that showed her interest and intelligence. She spoke of her travels, her family, and her people. Though she avoided discussing the storm that had separated her from them, there was a pain there she did not want to revisit yet. By mid-afternoon, Elias brought out a simple task for her to help with. "If you feel up to it," he said, "the animals need feeding. The snow is heavy on their pens, and the horses could use some hay." Naira hesitated, glancing at the snow-covered door. "I can try," she said finally. "I've traveled long distances with horses. I can help." Together, they stepped outside into the blinding snow. The cold hit Naira immediately, cutting through her damp clothes, despite the layers Elias had given her. But she did not complain. She lifted hay bales, brushed snow off the horses' backs, and guided the animals to shelter. Elias worked alongside her, showing her which animals needed attention most. There was a quiet rhythm in their work, a shared understanding that did not require words, a bond forming in the silence of labor and survival. By evening, both returned to the cabin, tired but satisfied. Naira's cheeks were flushed from the cold, her hair sticking to her face, but her eyes sparkled with a sense of accomplishment. Elias gave her another cup of tea and a warm blanket. "You've done well today," he said. "The animals are safe, and the barn is secure. I wouldn't have managed it alone." Naira smiled faintly. "It feels good. To help, even in a storm." She paused, then added softly, "and to not be alone." Elias nodded, understanding more than she realized. Loneliness could be heavier than any storm, colder than any winter wind. He had spent years carrying it quietly, thinking it was part of life. But seeing Naira, her fear and courage intertwined, made him realize how much companionship mattered, even temporary, even fragile. That night, the wind was fierce. It shook the cabin walls and made the fire hiss as ice and snow hit the roof. Naira sat near the fire, warming her hands and watching the flames dance. Elias chopped more wood, careful not to break the quiet atmosphere they shared. Outside, a pack of wolves could be heard in the distance, their cries echoing across the plains. Naira's eyes widened slightly, and she reached for the lantern. Elias noticed her instinctive readiness to protect, her attention sharp even while exhausted. "Do not worry," Elias said calmly. "They won't come near if we keep the fire strong." But Naira shook her head. I cannot ignore danger. Even small, I must face it." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her posture. He nodded, realizing that courage was not only physical strength, but also the willingness to face fear head-on. "Then we face it together," he said. "I would not want you out there alone." They went outside briefly when the wolves approached the edge of the property. Elias had a rifle, and Naira held the lantern, guiding the light toward the shadows. The wolves circled, curious, but neither attacked. Elias fired a warning shot, and they retreated into the storm. The wind carried their cries away, leaving the plains silent once more. Back inside, both were breathless and tense but safe. Naira set the lantern on the table and exhaled slowly. "You are brave," she said softly. "Not many men face danger like that." Elias shook his head. "It's survival. Nothing more, but thank you for staying with me. Your courage helped too." The night wore on, and they talked quietly by the fire. Naira opened up more, sharing stories from her youth, the lessons taught by her family, the long journeys with her people, and the times she had to be strong when others were not. Elias listened, fascinated by her experiences. He had grown up in isolation, but her life had been full of motion, responsibility, and wisdom beyond her years. "You've seen so much," Elias said, "and yet you still have hope. That is rare." Naira looked at him, her eyes soft. "Hope is what keeps us alive. Even in storms like these, we need it." For a moment, the world outside seemed to pause. The wind howled, but inside, a fragile trust had grown. They were two strangers bound by circumstance, yet slowly, day by day, the walls they carried inside themselves were beginning to lower. Each small act, handing hay, lighting the fire, sharing stories, built something neither had expected. Companionship. By the time sleep approached, Elias had prepared the cabin for the night. The fire burned low but steady. Blankets were ready, and the animals were fed and sheltered. Naira lay down again, this time without hesitation, her body still tired, but her spirit lighter than before. She trusted the cabin and the man who had opened its door to her in her most desperate moment. Elias sat in his chair, watching the flames, thinking about the strange turn of events. The storm had brought her to him, yes, but it was more than luck that kept her here. It was courage, trust, and the quiet bond that grew with each shared moment of survival. He realized that in years of solitude, he had forgotten what it felt like to share space, time, and life with another human being. Naira reminded him, in the simplest and most urgent way, that warmth and trust mattered. Even more than fire in the hearth. Outside, the storm continued. Snow drifted high, covering the land in white. Wolves could be heard faintly in the distance, and the wind whistled against the cabin walls. But inside, two hearts had begun to trust each other, forming a quiet understanding that words could not fully describe. Naira had survived the night, but she had also survived loneliness, fear, and doubt, because someone had let her in. Elias had gained more than a visitor. He had gained a connection he thought was impossible after years of isolation. The night deepened, and the fire crackled. Elias checked the windows, the doors, and then glanced at Naira. She slept peacefully now, her face calm, her breathing even. He knew that this peace was temporary, that the storm might rage longer, but the bond between them was real. The snow outside could rage, the wind could scream, and yet inside, there was warmth, safety, and trust. The first night of the storm had passed, and with it, the first lessons of companionship. The days ahead would test them further, but Elias felt a quiet hope. The lonely cowboy had opened his door and heart, and the Apache woman who had pleaded to be let in had begun to become part of his life, not just as a visitor, but as someone who mattered. The storm had brought them together. The days trapped inside would teach them trust, courage, and the small acts that create bonds stronger than snow and wind. And in that quiet, snowbound cabin, two lives began to intertwine in a way neither had expected, but both would never forget. Days passed slowly under the weight of the storm. The wind howled without pause, and snowdrifts buried the land beyond Elias Turner's cabin. What had begun as a night of desperation had turned into several days of shared survival. Naira, the young Apache woman who had pleaded for shelter, and Elias, the solitary cowboy, had developed a quiet rhythm. Every task, from feeding the animals to keeping the fire alive, became a small lesson in trust and companionship. Elias had observed her closely. Despite her exhaustion and the dangers of travel, she carried herself with calm authority. Her movements were deliberate. Her gaze was always alert, watching for the slightest sign of danger. He could see that she had survived hardships before this storm, Yet the fear and cold she had faced outside had humbled even her. And he, too, felt a change within himself. Years of solitude had taught him independence. But now he recognized that sharing burdens, even small ones, could lift a weight he hadn't known he carried one morning. When the sun barely broke through the thick gray clouds, Naira approached Elias at the fire with a quiet determination in her step. "We should check the barn," she said. Her voice was steady, but Elias could see the concern in her eyes. "The snow is heavy. It could harm the animals if we do not clear it soon." He nodded. "You're right. Let's go." The cold outside was biting, sharper than any previous day. Snow clung to their boots and clothing, and their breaths came in white clouds. Elias handed Naira a shovel while he cleared the path to the barn. She worked quickly, strong and capable, her hands moving with efficiency despite the cold. When they reached the barn, she inspected the animals and shifted bales of hay, making sure the horses were fed and sheltered. Elias noticed her tenderness in caring for the animals, a quiet empathy that contrasted with her strong, resilient exterior. By late afternoon, they returned to the cabin, exhausted but satisfied. Naira removed her gloves, her fingers red but steady, and poured them each a cup of warm tea. They sat side by the fire, the silence between them comfortable now, filled not with uncertainty, but with a shared understanding. "You are different from anyone I have met," Elias said quietly. "Strong, but gentle. Brave, but careful. You carry your burdens without complaint." Naira smiled softly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "And you are not as alone as you pretend. The quiet life you live hides a heart capable of kindness. I can see it now, after these days." Elias looked into the fire, feeling warmth that had little to do with the flames. It was the first time in years he had shared such words or received them. They sat together, speaking less now and simply appreciating each other's presence. That evening, faint sound came from outside, a distant cry carried on the wind. Naira's eyes sharpened. "My people. They are searching." She rose and walked to the window, squinting through the blowing snow. "They must be near. I can feel it." Elias nodded, understanding immediately. "When they arrive, will you leave?" Naira turned, her eyes meeting his. I do not know. I must see them, yes. But these days, you have given me safety. You have shown me care. It is not easy to leave that behind." Elias's chest tightened. He had grown fond of her courage and quiet strength. The thought of her leaving filled him with unease he hadn't anticipated. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "They will wait, and so will I, for as long as you need." The next morning, the storm began to subside. Snow fell lightly, and the gray sky brightened with hints of sunlight. The world outside the cabin was transformed into a white, silent wonderland, fresh and untouched. In the distance, dark shapes approached horses moving through the snow, their riders determined. Naira's people had arrived. Her heart raced as she watched them, fear and relief mingling together. Elias stood beside her, offering quiet support. The riders, Apache men and women, came quickly, scanning the landscape until they spotted the cabin. They approached and dismounted, their eyes widening as they saw her alive and well. Their voices called her name with relief, echoing across the snow. Elias stepped aside, allowing them to reach her. The leader of the group, an older man with kind eyes, spoke first. "Naira, you are safe." He embraced her gently, then stepped back, observing Elias. "And you? You are the man who kept her safe?" Elias nodded. "Yes, she found herself outside in the storm. I could not turn her away." The leader's expression softened. "You have done what many would not. You have honor." "Thank you." Naira's eyes lingered on Elias. She felt a mixture of emotions: relief at seeing her people safe, gratitude for the man who had saved her life, and an unexpected attachment to the cabin where she had found warmth and safety. She turned back to the riders. "I am well," she said, "but I need a moment." Elias watched quietly, understanding her need. He knew that the time they had spent together had forged something deeper than simple survival. He could see it in the way she moved, in the way her eyes held warmth despite the cold, and in the gentle smiles they exchanged. The group of Apache riders respected her silence and waited. Naira turned back to Elias, her eyes full of unspoken words. "If I go with them now," she said softly, "it will not be the cold that takes me. It will be leaving this place, and leaving you." Elias felt a lump in his throat. He had not expected to feel this way an attachment, a longing, a hope that she might stay. But he knew he could not force her choice. "You don't have to leave if you do not want," he said gently. "This cabin, these doors, they are yours as much as mine. You are welcome here." Naira's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She looked at her people, then back at Elias, and finally spoke softly. "Then I will stay. For now. The world beyond is waiting, but I have found something here I did not expect." The Apache leader nodded, understanding in silence. They respected her choice, knowing that she had found safety and trust that could not be rushed. Slowly, the riders mounted their horses, giving her space. Naira turned fully to Elias, taking a deep breath. "I cannot explain everything," she said, "but these days, they changed me, and I do not want to leave without acknowledging that." Elias smiled, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. "Then stay. Build your life here if you wish. You are safe, and you are welcome." The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a soft light across the snow-covered plains. The storm had ended, leaving the world bright and quiet. The cabin glowed from within, smoke curling gently from the chimney. Inside, Elias and Naira moved about together, preparing for the first calm day since the storm began. Their work was simple tidying, feeding the animals, lighting the fire, but it was done side by side, in harmony and understanding. As evening approached, Naira stood at the doorway, looking at the horizon. She breathed deeply, feeling the cold air on her face, but also feeling something new hope. She had survived the storm, found shelter, and discovered trust in a stranger who had become more than a man who opened his door. He had become a friend, a protector, and perhaps something even more. Elias joined her, standing quietly beside her. "The world can wait," he said softly. "Here, there is safety. Here, there is warmth. Here, you are not alone." Naira looked at him, and for the first time in many days, she smiled fully. It was not a weary smile, nor one of relief alone. It was a smile of choice, of trust, and of connection. "Then I will stay," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Not because of the storm, but because of you." Elias felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling he had not known in years. The storm had brought them together, but it was their courage, their patience, and their trust that had kept them close. They had survived the cold-faced danger and discovered companionship in a way neither expected. Night fell, and the cabin glowed warmly. The wind outside had quieted, leaving the world soft and white. Inside, Elias and Naira sat by the fire, talking quietly, sharing simple stories, and enjoying the presence of each other. The snow outside glistened in the moonlight, untouched and pure. A reminder of the trials they had overcome together. The lonely cowboy was no longer alone. The Apache woman was no longer lost. Together, they had turned a night of fear into days of trust, survival, and hope. And in the quiet warmth of the snowbound cabin, new life had begun, one built on respect, courage, and the quiet power of human connection. For Elias Turner and Naira, the storm was over. But their journey together was only beginning, and from that night onward, the cabin was not just a shelter from the cold. It was a home where trust, warmth, and the courage to choose companionship could grow. Long after the snow melted,